so on. And of course, I encourage you to try out the store yourself. But we'll quickly dive into what would it take for you as an app builder to start developing apps for Windows 8.1. The tools that you would typically need would be some design tools and some development tools. From a design perspective, as you know, Windows and Windows 8 specifically uses the metaphor of the modern UI and a very specific design language. And later on in the webinar, I will share with you links through which you can learn a little bit more about the unique user experience, look and feel that is required for Windows 8 or that is required for developing an app for Windows 8. And Expression Blend, which comes as part of Visual Studio, is one of the tools that you could potentially use for designing your apps. But of course, you're free to use other tools also, and some of you might be familiar with Adobe tools and all that. Could potentially also use that and then eventually import that into Visual Studio, which is essentially the development tool that you will use. And it's good to know that many of you are familiar with Visual Studio. Some of you, of course, are beginners, some of you are intermediate, and a few of you are advanced. But Visual Studio is essentially the tool that you would use to develop apps using various technologies. You could use C++, you could use C#, you could even develop using HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, the question that might arise in your mind is how do you get access to Visual Studio? Again, the good news is that for an individual developer, if you are trying this out within your own free time, for example, and not necessarily part of your day job, you can consider downloading Visual Studio Express 2013 for Windows 8. That is freely available, and towards the end of my presentation, I'll share the links from which you can download that. It's a free download. Of course, if you're in an organization and if you have Visual Studio Professional Edition, for example, as part of your organization, then that could be something that you could also consider using. You'll get a few more additional features as part of Visual Studio Professional Edition, obviously. But Visual Studio Express Edition is good enough to get you started in terms of developing your first Windows Store app, and it contains everything that you need to be able to get an app into the store. Visual Studio also enables a whole bunch of performance tuning and analytics that you can run on your application. This is something that not many people often are aware of, but this is something that we encourage you to leverage as part of excuse me. We encourage you to leverage as part of the entire Visual Studio tool set itself. And profiling is a very important part in terms of making sure that your app performance stays as expected, and so that your updates that you push out to your apps continue to improve performance based on feedback that you might gather. For example, if your app crashes in certain scenarios, as part of the Windows Store, as part of the Developer Center, we give you diagnostics, or we give you tracking mechanisms to be able to track the scenarios in which your app might have crashed, and so that you can make the improvements in your app in the next version update or release that you put out. In terms of the various APIs, of course, I won't go through this into detail because this itself would be a separate webinar, but at the high level, we cover a whole range of APIs spanning from the fundamentals, which include things like threading, memory management, globalization, cryptography, authentication, as well as diagnostics. And then moving on to areas like communications and data, wherein we support local storage, we support XML and JSON, SMS, background transfer, and networking. We also support a whole range of graphics capabilities, which includes Direct 3D, Direct 2D, which you typically use for gaming scenarios. We also support WebGL. Like I mentioned earlier in the session, we support 3D printing. And from a devices perspective, we support things like obviously Bluetooth, USB, Wi-Fi, geolocation, sensors, which is another big emerging market. You'll see that there are many laptops and tablet devices which come inbuilt with a whole range of sensors, which include things like accelerometers, for example, to detect the tilt of the tablet, and so that you can actually take advantage of that within your own apps. And finally, from a UI perspective, we support accessibility. For those of you who are not familiar with this term, accessibility essentially is to enable your applications to be accessible to people who might have some form of disability. The disability could be visual impairment, it could be speech impairment, hearing impairment, and so on. And this is really something important to keep in mind when you're developing, that whenever you're developing an app, you should remember that there might be people who are using your app who may not have all the capabilities that a normal human has, and therefore they might have diminished vision, they might have diminished hearing, or may have even some issues with being able to move a mouse, for example, but might be able to access your app using touch. So those are things that you can keep in mind. We also support live tiles and toast, like I mentioned, which are notification mechanisms, as well as HTML5, CSS, and XAML from a front-end perspective. Moving on, so how will you get started in terms of developing your first Windows 8 app? The things that you will require will obviously, you'll need to have some flavor of Windows 8 on your machine. Now, if you already have Windows 8 as the primary operating system on your machine, that's great. If you don't, let's say, for example, you have Windows 7 on your machine, then one of the options that you have is to download the Windows 8.1 Enterprise Trial, and the URL should be appearing on your screen right now. Once you download this trial, we would suggest that, because it's a trial edition, we would suggest that you can install it in dual boot mode, so that you can retain your existing operating system exactly as it is without anything impacting whatever you might be running on that, and then use this Windows 8 trial version for your development, for your learning purposes, and so on, until such time as when you feel comfortable enough to make Windows 8 your primary machine. But while you're in the learning phase, we definitely recommend that you should consider installing the Windows 8 trial in a dual boot mode, so that you don't lose any of your existing work that you might have in whatever existing operating system you have. In terms of the development tool, you will use Visual Studio 2013, which is available, like I mentioned, VS Express 2013 for Windows. The URL is also put up there on the screen. You should be able to download that for free and get started with developing the first Windows 8 app. To help you build your first Windows 8 app, we in India have created about 75 Windows 8 templates. Think of templates as a starter kit. When you want to develop your first app, you might be slightly clueless about what kind of design to use. You may not be completely comfortable with the new modern UX design metaphor that is required to be done to be used in Windows 8 apps. So therefore, to help you get started and give you examples of some of the designs that you can use for your apps, we've created 75 plus templates, and these are essentially starter kits. They don't contain any business logic, or they don't contain any meaningful logic as such in terms of coding, but they contain designs which are like a skeleton on which you can build upon, and you can then add your own functionality and logic to it. So feel free to go ahead and use it. These are available on Codeplex. Codeplex is a website that Microsoft runs for open source code that we put out there. I know some of you might be surprised that Microsoft has an open source website called Codeplex, but it's been in existence for multiple years, and there's a lot of projects out there, not just by us, but even by external folks in the community who've put out projects which are available publicly for consumption at no cost. So we encourage you to go ahead and use those templates as the case may be, depending upon your app idea. Of course, please make sure that you're adding some value over and above the templates, and not just using the templates as they are, because the templates are a starting block. They are not the end of the app. They are not the culmination of the app. The template should simply be the starting point of your app, and then we expect you to build more functionality and more features into that as the case may be. Similarly, for those of you who have created an iOS app or an Android app in the past, and you're thinking about how you can port that app over, or how you can reuse some of the code, Some of the guidance that would be useful for you is available on the links that I mentioned there. So aka.ms/ios will take you to the relevant resources for porting over iOS apps, and similarly aka.ms/android will take you to the resources correspondingly for Android. Let's say you've now built your first app after a few weeks, and you want to publish your app onto the store. What would you then require? You need to have a developer account. The developer account for an individual is available on a 1-year subscription. So you typically need to purchase a 1-year subscription as an individual, and the current cost is $19, $19 for an individual and $99 for a company. And this is for the Windows Store account, the developer account. The good news is that once you set up a developer account for 1 year, you not only get access to the Windows Store, but you also get access to the Windows Phone Store. So which means if you're interested in creating apps for the phone, you could also publish your apps there, and it's the same one developer account gives you access to both the stores for 1 year. And for students, of course, this is available for free through the dreamspark.com website. And students who have access to dreamspark.com can get its developer account for free. Moving on. So in terms of the technologies, like I mentioned earlier on in the webinar, you have the choice of